handle everywhere is full stack TC. I'll try and get better about updating people with new events. That's a work in progress. Generally speaking, the first Wednesday of every month, we're here. So shout out to Wildlands for sponsoring this meetup and helping make it possible to use for our facility and Real Hacks to provide groups. Wildlands has careers posted online frequently. If you're looking for career change, that's wild.land/careers. Also, my employer is hiring as well for backend web engineers, so if you are interested, come talk to me afterwards. Tri-City Game Devs, I'll let maybe Nathan put a plug in for that.
Sure. So the first Friday of every month, we meet. We have a 20, 30-minute talk, and then you can share what you've been working on for the last month. But most of it is open time to collaborate and mentor and work on your game projects. And so, at all skill levels. It doesn't have to be programming. You can do art, you can do composition, you can do sound design, you can do narrative design. There's a lot that goes into game dev, and so we just encourage people to participate and grow. So that'll be this Friday at 6, right here.
Yeah, that lines up nicely. So first Wednesday full stack, first Friday is TC Game Devs. Feel free to grab some pizza. I got one more coming out. I decided to do a take and bake this time. Try it out. So my quote for the month is very short. I'm still learning. Michelangelo said that one. The point of the meetups is to try and encourage self-education and learning and constantly improving or investing in yourself and growing. So I think if somebody as big as Michelangelo was constantly learning, we can all learn something in our lives. So next month, Trevor will be giving a talk on running LVM and ZFS on a Linux system. If you're interested in coming out for that, June 5th, 6:30. And then July is open, but we're thinking about doing another kind of big event for maybe a lightning talks like we did last year, and having like a potluck or something like that. So we'll see. If you're interested in doing a short talk, 10 minutes. I think last time we did about 5 to 10 minutes max. So something like that. If you're interested, let me know or submit on the website. And those will be good for July. Today, Chad will be giving a talk on moving from database tokens to JavaScript web tokens for RESTful APIs. So.
Okay, and I'm Chad Zink, software engineer, and I have a favorite color. It's green. What I was saying before is I was thinking about putting a little bit of context around this discussion, not so much a presentation. I recently was asked to look into or finish off something that was already started, which was implementing JavaScript web tokens or JSON web tokens for the authentication system at one of the projects that I was dealing with. And I thought, well, I'm just going to get this, take it over, change a couple of configurations, and then we'll go. Unfortunately, that's not how it went, and I had to learn a lot about this whole authentication process. And every time I kind of went into it more, I learned a little bit more about authentication. The context, though, is that I haven't been doing this long. So about a month of really diving into authentication and learning whatever I could. And then I asked Michael, hey, if you need to talk, I'll come talk about what I learned. But diving into this and putting something together, I realized how much I actually still don't know about authentication and what that world is. So I'm sure you could spend your entire, you have a full-time job just dealing with this particular subject potentially. So that's the context around it. Because of that, I would like to kind of leave this very open. So if you guys just interrupt me at any time and say, I want to bring this particular point up about that topic. So that way we have a lot more interactions. And then I had thought about maybe splitting the room and saying all right, you guys think JWT, that's it, there's nothing else. And then this side think, no, we're gonna go with database tokens and we're gonna store everything in there. So if yeah, we'll do that. We'll just split them. Okay. So as we're watching this, think about that. Think about you're going to be in favor of JavaScript tokens, and you're going to be in favor of not using them, because it's not a simple decision, and it's not clear cut as to which is a better solution overall, potentially. So a little bit more about me real quick, because this is what you're supposed to do. I am a full stack developer, so that means that I'm not actually good at any part of the stack. I've just got the whole thing. And then I've also split my brain power between multiple languages. So I'm really just decided to cover everything. I have done a lot of .NET, a lot of Ruby, and then I'm doing much more PHP and Symfony. So, but I've got plenty of time to pack all this stuff in there. And because of that, I've learned that teamwork is really the only way to get through. If you can find people who are experts and then try to help them out, it works really well. Before I get into this, there's some terms that I wanted to kind of just discuss and make sure that the group is comfortable with these things. So these terms are really critical to the process. And of course, you've got, JSON, JavaScript, object notation. We don't need to really focus on that. But other things here, like when I say authentication, that means something very different than authorization. So if there's any of these topics that anybody wants to ask a question about before we get started, I can kind of maybe define that a little bit more. And I had to pare this down because there's actually more stuff. But so we're good with these things? Even Jonathan? Okay, so we'll move forward then. One of the things though is I am going to be focused on the concept of the RESTful API and the single page web app. Like there's a lot more to authentication, but that's just where I'm at right now. So in my mind, I was writing this down, like what does a typical web application do? And I kind of like just jotted these things down. Like, you go to the website, it asks you to log in, you log in, and then it gives you access to the application. It's a very simple process, like that just happens every day. And we've been working on that for a long time, so it's really simple. So then I started going into more detail, like, wait, what just actually happened between the server and the client and all of those other things in between? And I'm not going to talk about all of those things because there's a lot there. And this is just what I spilled out of my head when I was thinking about it. But if I put it into a picture, we can see it a little bit better. We can see that the client makes a request to the server. The server says, well, actually, usually the client says, do I know who I am? Am I going to send that off already? He says, no, I need to log in. So he sends it off to the server. So he says, yes, you need to log in. And so it goes through this process of communication. And this is for a NetBeans website or something like that. So that's why you'll see the login.jsp. But it was a pretty good representation of kind of the process. But over the years, we've kind of developed these API calls, and you have this process where you have the user log into the web application, and the system that I'm the most familiar with is the database tokens. And so I wanted to kind of say, like, this is where we're at, and how it works is essentially that you have a controller on the server that gets the username and password, and basically says, yeah, that matches what I have. So I'm gonna generate this random session identification, and then I'm gonna store it, and I'm gonna give it to you, back to the client. That way, when you make more requests, I just compare those two keys, and I say, yeah, you're still who you said you were. So that way, we have this agreement. Now, way back when we had like the web pages that would transition from one to another, they actually did that with just sending it back to the client, and then the client would send it back in the header, and then it would just kind of make these round trips. It kind of existed in memory. But that creates a stateful situation in which if something goes down, like you kind of lose track of where you were at or what was going on with the application. Because the application state is really important. As you're using the app, things change. And if you close the browser, for example, if you were just storing things in memory, you no longer have that connection. So we got this idea of storing it in the database. So the database now tracks the ID for that user, and it gives it some of the information that we need to take that user and look them up so they can get things like what authorization do they have to use the website and kind of move forward. And it works really well, but it does require a little bit of overhead. So over here on the right-hand side, you see that this is where you have to do into your database. You usually, at minimum, have to have your user table, which has your username and then your encrypted password, as well as you have a sessions table that you have to keep track of, when does it expire, and you have to kind of clean up that thing. So that's kind of how I thought about the database tokens, and I tried to cover as much as possible. Is there anything that you guys can think of that is kind of important on the server side for the database token aspect of things? Okay. Is this interesting? Yes? Okay. Then I wanted to discuss really quickly kind of what happens on the client side, because it's actually important what's happening over there as well, because when the client gets this token, he says, well, I'm going to have to use this token to make further requests. So one of the things that it often does is it stores it in local storage. And local storage for web front end is where it says, this is some memory that I'm going to use, and I'm going to remember that this stuff is here. And when you close the browser, you bring it back up. It's a lot like, well, it's not, never mind. It's not like cookies, but it works really well. There's other storage options. You can actually use a session storage, which doesn't persist and kind of goes away when you close the browser or when you close the tab. And then, yeah, the other important thing that the client does is it has to take that token and it has to send it back to the server through the HTTP header. It can do it through form submits, but that gets a little complicated because like if you do a GET request doesn't have a form package or a form body, so it's better to send things through the header. I can't think of another way to send the token back to the server. It's usually going to be through the form data or it's going to be through the header, but I'm sure there's alternates.
15 years ago, you used to see PHP session ID in your URL all the time.
Yes, and it was the same thing with .NET. You would see session ID in the URL. That was odd.
Yeah.
Now that we think about it, we're like, well, we're just going to hand that away. Like, yeah, go ahead and look at what it is.
Yeah, and what I wanted to say, when you said earlier why stateful is a big deal, it's also a big deal if you're running more than one server. Like if you're running a bunch of servers and you want to handle the session, if it's stateful, where you have to load state every time from every server.
Yeah.
There's some overhead to that.
Yeah, and I think the multiple server system gets really complicated, and so it clearly doesn't work with the memory session handling. Like the one server they don't share the same memory space, so you have to put it in the database where they can at least both use the same database resource to look up what the key is. But on top of that, if you start to have like a web app that's built around multiple APIs, things get even more complicated because if you've got a server that has its own set of users, its own set of sessions, and then you have another service that has its own set of users, its own set of sessions, you have to manage those two things simultaneously. And it gets to be a little odd. So that's an area where when you look at this structure and this design, it kind of starts to break down a little bit. But there are solutions for that where they have like authentication servers that just deal with authentication. So some advantages to that structure is that you have all of your session tokens stored in a table. So you can query as like an administrative panel and say, I'm going to dump these people out of the web app. And then when they try to make another request, they no longer have access to the resources anymore. And you can also look at how many people are currently connected to your web backend. Like I have all of these people who are using the system right now, so you could tell what the impact would be of the server going down. And you can easily just update the database table and extend a session expiration where you're like, okay, I don't really need to manage this on the client side. I can just keep bumping this every time they hit the API. I can say, give them another 30 minutes of activity. Not that that's a good strategy, but that is something you could do. And when you're dealing with the sessions, you can follow kind of that CRUD kind of model for RESTful APIs if you really wanted to kind of make a resource around that, which you probably wouldn't do, but it follows the same pattern. So you're very familiar with how that all works. By the time you get to this point, you know how to do But as with a lot of things in technology, something gets really popular. And once it's popular, we have to start using it. That's just how it works. So let's forget about all that and just say that that doesn't work because it's no longer hot anymore. And I'm kind of skipping some steps here because I'm not really describing what the JSON Web Tokens are, but I'm just kind of going into a little bit of the server. But there are some things that it introduces that are kind of complicated, but also not that complicated. So now what we're doing is instead of storing the session ID or generating a random number, we're using public and private keys. And so once we have those set up on our server, we can actually start to encrypt stuff and encode stuff so that it's not, you can't just look into the data that's in there. So before, when we were with the database, we're just sending off this random character string. Usually, it's not always random, but it doesn't usually contain any real data because it doesn't need to. It's just a key to match up with. But that's going to change in JSON. What JSON is doing is this JSON Web Token is actually going to contain data. So once we've verified that the user is who they say they are, we're going to create a JSON object that represents the user, and then we're going to encode it with our private key and send this really long token back to the client that has a lot more information in it than just something that matches up. More importantly, the server doesn't really care anymore what the value of that token is in regards to like the actual value. It just wants to know, can I decode that when it gets sent back to me? And when I decode it, does the information match what I think it should match? So
what do you mean by encoded?
Encrypted. Sorry, that's a much better word.
Well, JWTs are always encrypted?
They're a series of 3 encrypted values put together, I believe, as far as I know. Like, this is where it gets into the area where maybe I don't understand it as much as I think I do.
Sometimes it's just base64 encoded JSON, and then a dot, and then the signature, so you're signing the data.
Okay.
So anything that sees it could decode it.
Yes.
But nobody can change it.
Right. Yeah, so that, and I was going to cover that, but that's important. We could talk about it. So from what I understood, there was the 3 parts. Is the header is like, talks a little bit about what kind of data is in it, and then, or like what type, and then the body is that middle section, and then the last part is the signature. And so having all 3 of those, and the signature has to match. So if somebody messes with it, like they tried to decode it and tried to put new values in, the signature should no longer show it as valid. So the server will say, that is not a valid token anymore. I don't agree with that, and just rejects the token. But yeah, they're literally separated by dots. So you've got encrypted value, dot encrypted value. And I think you might be right that you don't actually have to have a header either. I think you can
But if it's actually encrypted, it sounds like it may be just authenticated. We distinguish between encrypted and authenticated.
It's not always encrypted.
Yeah.
It can be. So that's what you're specifying in the header.
Yes.
The head section too.
So this is where we get into some of the problems with the JWT tokens, or the JWTs as well. It doesn't require that you encrypt it, but you're supposed to. Like, you're supposed to use an encryption algorithm, and you're supposed to keep your private key private. And that hasn't always been the case with everybody that's used them. So if you don't encrypt it well, and you don't use a key to encrypt it with, it's really easy to decode the value. So if you just, so that's something that's really important, because some of these systems, when you install them or you set up the package to go with your framework, they do usually say you need to have this, but some of them do some stuff in the background. You think, oh, this is fine. It's working exactly how it's supposed to. And it turns out you didn't actually provide a key to encrypt the value with.
So how does the token pass back to the server? Is it in the header?
Exactly the same way as the other one, yeah. I think it's up to the developer to do it, but usually it's just passed back in the authorization portion of the header, and usually it's prepended with a bearer, and so it'll say bearer space and then the full value of the token string. So on my test application, I also wrote, I used this out to try it out, and my token value is pretty short. It's only like a couple hundred characters long. But at work, they had a little bit more stronger requirements for the amount of data that's in the body. So it's a much longer. It's like I think like 800 or 900 characters. And so one of the questions I have is like, that doesn't seem very effective to be sending back this large chunk of data in the header for every single API request. Okay, so my research did show me, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, that those are the things that are in there for the actual token. So you have which algorithm was used to encode it, and you can kind of specify the type. And then there's more to the claims, but the claims is the payload. Like this is the username and other things. Like if I wanted to put like an array that represented the different roles they played in the client system, I could send that as well. But you do have to sign it. And then separate it. A little more to that system that we'll cover, but looking at the advantages of this, even though we're dealing with encryption and even though you can shoot yourself in the foot, if you are not a database person, this is actually simpler to implement in some ways than the whole database user session stuff. Because you can just get these packages, then you just have this user table, or even however you get your users, you can actually specify how you're looking up your users. And you can really make your application a lot simpler with the Java Web Tokens. Because you don't have database tables, some people feel a lot more comfortable with that. They don't really want that overhead in their system, so that is an advantage. Some of the other things that are really nice is you start to get into these multiple systems. You can start to implement a single sign-on. So if you've got like 3 or 4 different applications and you have users who use those applications, you could actually start to say, well, use an OAuth server or a centralized authentication server to do that validation part, and then hand it back to my backend that actually create the token that the front end is going to use. So you have now you have 3 players in the game. You have your front end, your back end server, and then you have your authentication server. And the different applications can use the same authentication server. And it's really helpful because if people are setting up user ID and passwords over and over again, it can get really complicated. Plus, you can use public OAuth servers. So you can use Google or Facebook, some of those. Or Amazon has a really neat one called Cognito, and it works really well. I think it works well. I haven't really used it. The other advantage is that you can verify the token through public keys. So you can't decode, as far as I know, you cannot decode the token, but you can validate that it is a good token. So if the client is telling another backend server, like, hey, according to this front end, I'm a good user and I have access to this resource. He can say, without the private key, just using the public key, say, that checks out. I'm going to go ahead and deliver this resource to you because I trust this other server to use that. And then, of course, the biggest advantage is that it's trendy. So this was a meme I thought was pretty appropriate because I had this moment last week where I was looking at these large strings that were coming across and I thought, what have we done? And we get into some of the problems with it where we don't want these tokens to persist very long. We wanted them to persist for 60 minutes. So then the question becomes is when do I get a new token and how does that happen? So we kind of have to start looking into either creating this concept of short-lived tokens and long-lived tokens, where you start taking a long-lived token and you embed it into a short-lived token, or something a little simpler would be just every time you make a request, create a new token and send that back to the front end and say, update your token with this new value. I think we're still kind of trying to figure that out.
In this case, is it really a token or is it a new key for the client? When you're creating the token, is it really the token or is it the client gets a new key? Because I mean, the question I was also going to ask is who creates the secret key pair for the client? does the authentication server pass to the client, here's your private key to go utilize with all these other server vendors, if you will, or?
Yeah, I think it really depends. I mean, so in the examples that I've seen, I have my client and I have my back end. I haven't really dealt, well, a little bit with the OAuth, but in the back end creates the token every time. So the direct
The token
AV.
or the key? The key the client uses.
Sorry.
Question mark.
Sorry. In my particular case, what I'm talking about is it's called a token. There's no key with the JWT, or there's not like a single value that represents.
You might have an API key as well.
Okay, in this case, I'm thinking the key, if we're saying it's signing this transaction, are we
It's
presuming?
not signing the transaction. It's just signing the basic user information object.
So it's
Okay.
using the keys on the server on the back end to encode the data and send that off. It never sends the keys off.
So the secret key that the client has, is that something the client generates, or does the client receive it from the server upon authentication?
Upon authentication, the server generates a JWT and gives it to it, and the client can then just treat that as an opaque string, or if it's not encrypted. If a JWE is encrypted, a JWT is typically not.
Okay.
But
Oh, okay.
you can put that information in your thing and ahead of it. But anyway, so it can be decoded and looked at, but if you change it, obviously then the signature is invalid.
Yeah.
So, but you treat it as a secret opaque string for the most part.
Understood, but the server creates this, hands it to the client once, and the client keeps a hold of it.
Yep.
We're talking to the rest of them. Okay.
Yep. And typically, like Chad was saying, is that the server, when you first authenticate, it gives you one for the purpose of long-lived,
Yeah.
and then maybe that lasts 5 minutes, maybe it lasts half an hour, or whatever, right? And then it has to, and then whenever it gets 401 from using the short-lived one, it goes and gets another short-lived one with the long-lived one.
Okay.
And so that's your opportunity to revoke the token.
Yeah.
It's also the opportunity you can revoke the token, or you can just let it renew and still have that opportunity to revoke without logging the user out.
So
Necessarily.
one of the things I thought was interesting about this is that when the client gets the token back, it doesn't necessarily, can't really use it for anything other than knowing that he's a valid authentication is passed successfully. So you could send back the token along with the user, but usually the first thing you have to do after you get the token is go figure out who the user is. So it's not like now that you've been authenticated, it's okay for you to go look up who you actually are. So it requires this.
But if you encode that in the JWT and it's not encrypted, which it typically isn't,
Okay.
they can just decode that base64 section.
Okay.
That whole section.
Okay.
And then they can validate the signature. The client can validate the signature if it wants to, but it doesn't usually. 'Cause
Right.
it's got that directly from the server.
Interesting. I'll have to try that out because I haven't tried that yet. I never even
just
thought.
base64 decode, and then you get your JSON string, and then.
Okay.
Yeah.
It seems pretty simple.
Mhm.
And it saves you a trip back to the API to look up who
Yeah.
you are. And then is there more questions? Because I'm sure there are more questions at this point. But is it- okay. So yeah, so we're just mostly working with these tokens. It was just strong, just the key strings. But there are some concerns that have kind of come up when I was reading about some of these things, and that the server can't. Well, there's some strategies like Fritz was talking about on how to revoke tokens and how to like kind of get an opportunity to blacklist certain activity, and getting the chance to do that is important. So you can work around this one. But for the most part, when you send off these tokens to the client, the server doesn't have a lot of say in where they're at or who has them or what's going on with them. So there's some concern there. And then if your private key gets taken or lost, or somehow there's some kind of security problem with your web server, you really need to create a new private key, and that automatically revokes all the tokens that are out there. None of them will pass anymore. So you're bumping everybody off the server. And if you're using a token that lasted for like 10, 15 days, and people aren't usually authenticating, it could be really easy to get very concerned as to what's going on.
Do you normally store that private key like in a cut file or in a database?
Yeah, usually you just, what I've seen is you just store it in the server, so in like a place that's a secure location, but that don't, yeah.
Probably right next to the SSL keys for the server.
Well,
Yep.
oftentimes you use a secret service that sets an environment variable. That's the right way to do it, so that it's not on the file system. So the machine boots up, queries a secret service, sets it in the environment variable the way you go. But the simplest way is
So you
just store it in the
can
file.
roll it like in 24 hours.
What's that?
You can roll it like every 24 hours basically.
Oh, you wouldn't normally for your public-private key.
Is
For
that what-
storing your private key on the server, you wouldn't normally rotate that.
If you lock out everyone.
It's just, if you ever have a security incident, that's when you rotate it.
Yeah. So that's just something really important to know, because there were some cases of people having a security incident, and they were like, it doesn't really matter. I'm the web application developer, it's not going to make an impact. But if their private key got taken, then their tokens are no longer secure. Also, long-lived tokens, which I'm not trying to talk bad about them, but you can set up these long-lived tokens and you can encode them into cookies and do all kinds of clever things with them. But if you have a device that's authenticated this way that gets lost and somebody can get into that device, like it stays there for a long time. So people who have that device can suddenly be authenticated and use things. And there's really, like I said, there's not a way to just revoke that one token. They can't call you up and say, I lost my phone, I need to revoke this token. So there's some concern there.
Yeah, that's why I use the short-lived and the long-lived one.
Yes, that's a really good strategy. I think that's a strategy that we're probably going to have to figure out, because the other thing that I was seeing is that if you don't have some kind of strategy for that, you still have to deal with the session timeout. So if you're going to use short tokens, they're only lasting for a short period of time, you need to be able to refresh that. Otherwise, the user has to log in every 30 minutes.
So yeah, what happens is the client gets a 401, which says you're not authenticated, and it goes, oh, well, I'll use my long-lived one to the route that gives me short-lived. So there's a special route
Yep.
that gives you your session token, and you go get a new session token. And if that doesn't work, then you're considered logged out. So if that doesn't work, that means you got it revoked.
Yes. Okay. Interesting.
So then you go back to the login page. Yeah.
Okay. And I have seen one of the articles I've written was like they see like some attack that they perceive as an attack, and they look at the token and then they put that on a blacklist, and it says, do not authorize this token because it's not.
And typically also in those session tokens, you put the timeout value in the token itself. It's signed.
Yes.
So.
Yes. And then of course one concern is that if the tokens are bigger than the database tokens, when you start to look at web applications that are much larger user base, those tokens being passed through the header are actually taking up memory on the server while the users are logged in.
In flight.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I guess it's in flight, so it doesn't necessarily persist. But
It probably, like, typically what you do for a big installation is you stick something in front of it, in front of your API, like Nginx or some service or whatever, and it deals with the JWTs.
okay.
And then it goes, and then it might have a cache that goes, yeah, I've already validated that full opaque string recently.
Yeah.
I don't need to revalidate it.
Yeah.
And it may or may not do that, right? So.
This is actually the really great thing about this technology is that it has been vetted in a couple of areas, and there's some clever solutions. I wouldn't have thought of that, but that would work great for.
Yeah, so then you just have Nginx sitting, and all Nginx does is goes, oh, is that signature good? Yeah, okay, pass it on to the API. Oh, the signature's not good, and it might have a small cache. But really, those values are just in flight. They don't stick around.
So you're not going to have an issue where you're using up a lot of memory.
Right, you might specify a specific pool size for your cache, and it's not going to use up any more. You just throw away the oldest entry.
Okay.
It's only going to get as big as you want it to.
So far, do we have any other concerns that people could think about? Like maybe something in your head saying, this doesn't seem like a good idea.
It's scary that people don't treat them like secrets. Because
Yes.
if you don't treat it like a secret, that's oh, well, it's encrypted, or oh, it's signed, or So that's a concern, is that people get overconfident, and then they're like, oh yeah, I'll just give my token to this other thing, do this, and yeah, so in the architecture, you have to really keep it a secret, and again, a lot of people put things in local storage, and you have to think about what other applications are on that domain, because any application on that domain can see your local storage.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's nice that local storage is domain specific, but at the same time.
Right. If you're hosting a bunch of applications in your domain, then, and they can all see each other's local storage secrets, right? It's like, oh, well, I just got all the other applications, JWTs.
Yeah, we discussed that because we were talking about the multiple APIs, and we were like, well, we're not ready for a shared token across them, so we were like, we're going to store multiple tokens. So it means we but you can start clobbering your token in local storage. So the token name has to be unique, otherwise you're gonna.
And you have to realize that you're giving all of those other applications on that domain your token if you store it that way.
Yes, and in this case, I think they're okay with that, but we need to double check with the.
Because there's other encrypted storage you can do.
Oh, okay.
That doesn't do that.
Huh.
So there's ways around that.
Yes.
Do encrypted JSON web tokens ever get decrypted on the client side?
Not usually.
Yeah.
So if they did, their payload could contain some data that could be breached by someone.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're saying it's not a best practice to.
No, you wouldn't be able to, really, if you're doing it right, you wouldn't be able to decrypt it on that way, because you're using the private key on the server to encrypt it.
So, but for example, though, if you left a bunch of these tokens in local storage forever, and you put in there things like username, password, and email,
Oh yeah.
even though they're encrypted, that encryption algorithm can become not compromised, but they kind of like they get to the point where you want to stop using one and maybe use another one to make it more secure.
Yeah, they're not forward secret.
Yeah, so it's highly recommended not to store a lot of data in the package or the claims section, the middle section, because especially password. Like even though you're encoding or encrypting it, you still wouldn't put the password in there. And you still wouldn't. It's not a good idea to use email unless email is your. You have to have a way of identifying the user. So most times it's a username, but a lot of times people are using emails for usernames, which is fine. But you would only put what you're using for that particular thing. If you did have something that you really wanted to put in there, you can put it in there, but know that it's not a great idea for security.
Right. You don't want to consider it public information.
That's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. So yeah, you could store the user ID and then their like access control groups that they're in, but the server has to know that that's actually what it is by verifying the private key or the server permit and whatever. I mean, sorry, the signature is correct. And so that the user wasn't able to like add access control group there or whatever.
Well, another thing comes up too is like if you like put an access control group, and that access control group is used to render the front end, saying you're an administrator, so I'm going to give you the administrator tab, and now you can get in. You still need to secure the administrator resources on the API side. You can't just obscure those things away and say, well, as long as they don't have that tab. Yeah. So. Okay, and then I wanted to just say that when I was looking into it and I was able to do these 3 examples, although the .NET one I didn't really get as far as I wanted to in, I was able to implement it in Rails in like a couple of hours. PHP took me a little bit longer. That was like the 2-week thing, but it had a lot more complexity to it that was OAuth related. Overall, I think it's a day maybe to get it implemented, and they've got a really good package there. And the .NET one was just another couple of hours to implement for just sample projects to see how they work. So if you're starting up a small kind of test app and you want to try it out and just use this for your session authentication, it's pretty straightforward. Any questions on that though? And then we talked about some of this stuff, so you can probably skip over this slide. It's really your authorization and security. You need to be really careful about that. this is how people are accessing the resources on your server. So depending on how secure those need to be, you need to take security very seriously. And then you do want to kind of potentially manage things by setting up like a base controller. So if I'm getting a little too technical, but on the back end, it's really helpful if you have a centralized controller that handles some of this stuff. Otherwise, you have to program it into every single endpoint, every single controller, and it gets to be a little frustrating. So, but it's gonna take these steps where it extracts the token from the header, validates it, decodes it, and then you're gonna want to load up the current. So on the back end, every time you get a new token, you are gonna want to load up the current user, so that the back end knows who is requesting access to the resources. And that's just kind of a common thing. You see that in the database session tokens as well. And then I have a bunch of resources or links. And I have some more too, if somebody's really interested in it, they want to know what did you read or what did you find? Or just ask Fritz. But is there any other questions about this topic? Okay, so with this side of the room, you guys were in favor of the JWT tokens, right? I forgot.
I think backwards.
Backwards. Okay, so you guys are in favor of the database sessions. Have you been convinced that the database session tokens are no good and you need to switch to JWT?
I think it depends. Depends on the use case.
Yeah.
If you need something to go across multiple systems, that's where I'd like to see the application, because you don't need to have your entries copied across a bunch of these different services.
Yeah.
Or you got a server-side application still, it's not SPA, right?
Yeah, if you're not dealing with a single page
Or you already got that
application.
built in.
Especially if you're doing web forms, you're just constantly going from.
Yeah, but for SPA, yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Okay. And then on the other side, would you guys say is ready to abandon JWT tokens and go to database session tokens because that's just not going to work?
I like to use JWT. I mean, you have to use JWT for OAuth. So if
Oh.
OAuth is part of your, or you almost always do. Anyway, if OAuth is what you're doing, then you pretty much want to use JWT.
Okay.
So for REST, it's like unavoidable.
What's that?
For just a RESTful API, it's kind of unavoidable.
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do with it.
So convention wins in this case.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know, Drew, or sorry.
Well, because, yeah, OAuth is essentially JWT. I mean, intrinsically.
Yeah, I mean, he uses, yeah. I mean, OAuth, even OAuth 2 is fairly vague.
As I say, it's just a framework. OAuth.
Yeah, it's a paradigm.
I don't know a lot about it,
It's
but
not really very strict.
I do know every time I read about it.
Specifying the protocol, and JWT is something that fits
Right.
what OAuth is defined as.
Yeah.
Okay, so you could do OAuth without JWT, but it's just not commonly done because you got
Right.
JWT and it fits
Yep.
the, okay.
And it gets back to that concept of like why you do something when somebody's already done it.
Mhm.
Like you would have to design your own system that matched the protocol. So anyways, you had a question.
Well, I was trying to compare the two authentication architectures, and the one is database, the other is JWT. And it seems to me that the center of the database method is the consistency of one database. So if you want to authenticate the same user in multiple places, it all has to go back to the same database. Whereas with the JSON Web Token, the thing that's consistent that permits the authentication is the private key. And you can have multiple copies of it, which is useful when you have distributed systems.
Yeah.
But I was just trying to think is there ever a case when you can't trust your keys, your private key copies, to all be consistent? Like maybe your system is governed by two departments or something, and they're not going to maintain the copies of the keys like you want. And so you
That's
might,
fine
you
because
might,
it's a public key that you use to manage to validate it.
It's only the login server that has the private key, correct? Everything else has the public key.
So you'd have to you design it such that the private key is kept in one place, but that means that he's also the only place that you can decode it at. You can validate it in other places, if I understand it right.
Well, you're authenticating in that case, correct? You're not
Yeah.
necessarily encrypting, you're only authenticating at the location of the private key.
And that again is why JWTs are usually not encrypted. They're just signed.
Okay.
And that's why you have to treat them as secrets.
Here's what I'm getting at. I think you guys are just discussing things within the context of the idea that you have one private key and one single sign-on central authenticating server, which is a good architecture. But you could alternatively have 10 sign-on servers that all have the same private key, copies of it.
Yep.
And then we run into the possibility that someone changes the private key over here. And so the user that signs in with that server gets one encrypted token, and then he comes over to another server and he tries to sign in or tries to access the resources and he can't.
Yep.
And I know that that's a problem that can be solved, but I wonder if there would ever be a situation where you'd be forced into not trusting multiple copies of private keys like that, and then say that you have to go to the database. I'm not sure that there's a reasonable situation when that would happen, but I was just trying to think about it to see if that would be an argument against
You had that
federating
many,
the authentication.
I would think if you had that many sign-in servers, if you could give each one its own private key and all the resources could have the public key of all the acceptable sign-in servers, meaning if you had an issue with one sign-in server, you would just revoke it without revoking the rest of them.
I think that if you,
And I guess the question is, does JWT allow that in terms of, I'm sending in a signed value, who signed it?
Yeah. So I mean, you could encode that in the key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and you're starting to get into, if I believe right, Fritz can correct me, but when you look at the OAuth or the OAuth 2 protocol, the source of it, and there's like a client key that you can start to set up to manage some of these things where you say,
Yeah.
oh wait, this isn't who I expected to send me this key,
Yeah.
so that's, like I can't validate it because it's not what I expected.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, in your scenario, when you have a bunch of departments and they agreed to use the same private key and then they stop using the same private key, like, that's kind of a security policy problem at that point, rather than anything else. But you could just have everybody use their own key pair, and their service literally at an HTTP route has the public key on it. And then you always just go, oh, well, HTTPS, I know this key is from this service, great, I can use it to validate the token, and I know it's from them. I don't know how great that is, but you can do it. Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, generally you don't start just storing the private key in a bunch of places. Generally, you have a secret service that manages that for you. Like all the big cloud providers have secret services, and there's secret services for enterprise clusters and things like that too.
If you're in Britain, you have to use Her Majesty's big secret service.
So what's interesting to me is that you can take this technology and you can apply it in a lot of different areas. On a large scale, you're working at Facebook, you can apply it. If you're working on a side project in your backyard, you can apply it, and it does really well in different areas. But if you're going to do it on large scales, I would definitely consult with somebody on how to do it. So, yeah. So one of the things I wish that we had done was just consult and figure it out. All right, that's it for me. I think I'm gonna give this off to